Chapter 22. Red Seal Base, Antarctica. Kurt Weimeister swaggered through the bland corridors of the base's living quarters to find Clea Bennett's door open. Putting his hands on either side of the doorway, he leaned in and looked around, pleasantly conscious of the way his broad, sculpted shoulders and thick, muscled arms rippled beneath his thin t-shirt. The room was just like a generous 10 by 14 cubicle, painted off-white, with a full bed, bookcase, cheap desk, and an uncomfortable chair, bedside table, bureau, and a first-rate computer. Space was at a surprising premium in the base. Armoring against the Antarctic was almost as much trouble as guarding against the environment of the moon. Clea was packing. "Going somewhere?" he asked, half humorlessly. As if there was anywhere to go. "Yes," she said, coming out of the tiny bathroom. "Kushner, Locke, and I are going seal hunting." Clea gave him a sidelong smile. In a manner of speaking. "What about our work?" Kurt snapped, straightening. The I-950 turned a cool look on the self-styled Superman. "Hey Kurt, why don't you say that a little louder? I don't think Tricker heard you. Or you could wear a t-shirt that says, 'I break the rules, please punish me.'" Clea raised one sardonic brow at him as she crossed the room to take something from her bureau drawer. "If you want me to work with you, it wouldn't hurt to ask for my assistance. Officially." She gave him a very false smile. "I suspect Tricker thinks I want to be your groupie." Weimeister frowned. "I will speak to him now. This hour. I don't want you wasting your time fooling around with dumb animals." Serena had been right. Weimeister was ridiculously lacking in social skills, and laughably unaware of it. The man was convinced that it was his choice entirely that people left him alone. He was equally convinced that if he wanted someone's company, he could charm them into liking him. Fat chance, Clea thought. Weimeister had brains and good looks. But then, so did a very bright Doberman. Apparently, he's never tested that "I am charming when I want to be" theory. She turned to him with a slight smile. "Kurt, I'm going stir-crazy down here. I want to see some sky." She tilted her head towards him. "Okay?" "I didn't even know you were interested in pinnipeds," he said sullenly. The I-950 laughed. "I'm interested in everything, especially ringing concessions from Tricker. It amuses me." Frowning, Weimeister took a deep breath and crossed his massive arms over his swollen chest. "Is that for my benefit?" she wondered. "I don't like Tricker," he announced. "Big surprise there," Clea said. "I doubt he'd win a popularity contest hereabouts. If you don't like him, it should please you that I enjoy torturing him." Kurt snorted. "I suppose it should. But it concerns me that you claim to be going stir-crazy. It is a weakness, and you should fight any weakness in your character. It's a state of mind, and I'll do what I like. The I-950 gave him a hard look and watched him lift his head, like a bull scenting a challenger. She smiled back and looked away, a dimple in her cheek. "I'll be back in a week," she said. "You're just jealous because I'm getting to do something different." His stance and expression softened slightly. "Perhaps I'm jealous that you're going to be out on the ice with 2 other men." Clea laughed and went to embrace him, chuckling as his arms wrapped around her. She leaned back and looked up at him, her eyes sparkling. Yes, she was definitely developing a sense of humor. "You have to see these guys," she said. "Kushner is a potato with legs, and Locke looks like the mummy of Ramses II walking." She poked him in the chest, perhaps a little too hard, but he was such a jerk. "I've made my choice, and that ought to tell you something about my taste in men." This time he laughed, and something in the way of it was intended to remind her she'd been a virgin until she met him. "Exactly," she purred. Clea pushed herself off from his chest, forcing him to let her go, though he obviously didn't want to. Arching a brow, she asked, "Weren't you going to ask Tricker to allow you my services?" She smiled wickedly. "I can't dissuade you?" "Then I may as well go." He turned on his heel and walked out without another word. Clea snorted, knowing he heard her because she knew exactly how to direct sound to her intended hearer. She knew he'd been deliberately ambiguous, assuming that she'd wonder if he'd even bother to ask Tricker for her assistance in his work. As if he'd risk alienating her. Poor Kurt was a very lonely boy, and she'd made a point of filling his off hours with lots of rigorous exercise and stimulating conversation. What he considered stimulating conversation anyway, which alternated between talking about how wonderful he was, his absurd politics, and his project. Clea actually enjoyed talking about that last subject, though. So no, he wouldn't risk antagonizing her. By the time she got back, everything should be settled, and then she could begin work on the most important thing in the world. A thrill of anticipation shot through her. Skynet. Clea approached the downed leopard seal at a jog, moving effortlessly over the irregular, slippery surface of the ice. Had the humans been watching, she would have crept up on it, as if it was going to jump up and savage her. But she could plainly see that it was unconscious, and hear the rhythm of its heartbeat and breathing. The I-950 quickly plucked the orange-tipped dart from its side and stowed it away in her pouch. Then she pulled out a radio harness, tested it, and fitted it around the seal's body. Pulling out a punch, she added a tag to its flipper. All of this was done at speeds far exceeding the human norm. It kept her warmer, and she saw no reason to suffer when there wasn't anyone to witness her relative comfort. She couldn't push her metabolism too hard, unfortunately, as the supply of food was both limited and carefully calculated. So, like the humans accompanying her, her socks froze to the soles of her feet, and she actually needed the multiple layers of clothing she wore. Pulling a syringe out of her jacket, where it had been kept warm until this moment, so the saline medium didn't freeze, she carefully flushed the needle to eliminate air bubbles. Inside, just barely visible to the most refined sight her augmented eyes could manage, were the microscopic machines that would allow her control over this animal. She regretted the size of the things, but it was the best she could do with the materials at hand. The constant surveillance and supplies so carefully monitored. The I-950 had only gotten away with this limited number that she'd managed to cobble together because she was using minute pieces of parts that she then destroyed in experiments. Each machine had a tail like a sperm that would allow it to swim through the fluid surrounding the seal's brain to the area it was programmed to affect. There, it would gently drop onto the surface of the brain and adhere itself by releasing a microscopic drop of surgical glue. Then, tiny filaments would spin out, attaching themselves to crucial parts of the mammal's brain. Essentially, a more limited form of the machine-neuron symbiosis that made up her brain, and derived from the same technology. Not for the first time, she wondered how much of what Skynet would know in the future would come from research, and how much through a closed time-like loop from her. With an effort, she pushed these musings aside. The question was simply unanswerable, as was the question of where the information came from in the first place. That was meaningless when time travel was factored into the equation. The machines would respond to signals sent through a special transmitter that she'd added to the one on the radio harness. This should allow her to see and hear through the animal's eyes and ears. How well that would work exactly, she had yet to find out. The transmitter would also allow her to excite certain portions of the seal's brain to elicit a desired response. Relentless, violent rage, for example. In a world without Terminators, she had to improvise. Clea plunged the needle into the seal's neck at the base of the skull and inserted the machines. "Clea, what did you just do?" Hiram Locke trundled gingerly over to her across the ice. "Did I just see you inject air into that seal?" She couldn't see his face at all, as it was covered by a fleece balaclava and mirrored goggles. But she could tell from his voice that his expression was disapproving. "Hiram," she snapped back, "wouldn't that kill the animal?" He hesitated. "Yes," he said. "As we both already know that, what possible reason would I have to do something so stupid?" Locke looked around, as though hoping for backup. "Well, what were you doing?" he asked uncertainly. "I was trying to get a blood sample, but my fingers are numb and I missed the vein. Would you like to give it a try?" She stood and held out the syringe. No, he said, backing a step, holding up his mittened hands. She took a step closer to him. I had the impression you didn't think I knew how to use one of these. Her voice was hard, leaving no doubt as to how she felt about his interference. Wouldn't you like to demonstrate? Sorry, Locke said, continuing to back away. I spoke out of turn. What do you want? Clea asked. She wasn't happy that he'd come looking for her. He was supposed to be a couple of miles away with his partner. She'd been taking chances and he might have seen something. But the risks had been unavoidable. Her time alone was severely limited. Safety regulations demanded that no one go out on the ice alone. She'd only managed to acquire this time by making herself completely unendurable to the two humans. Still, I shouldn't have been taken unaware like that. With her whole body muffled by a balaclava, goggles, and a fur-trimmed hood, even her computer-enhanced senses were severely hobbled. She judged that she was currently human normal in the realm of her senses, which put her way ahead of her companions. Still, she should be more alert than a human, especially because of the reduction in her abilities. Clea wondered if, at some level, she was trying to get caught. Or perhaps I'm looking for an excuse to kill a human. Perhaps it was frustration over how long it was taking to get Skynet online. The computer that would one day be Skynet was exceptional, but it was just a machine, completely empty of consciousness. Being in the presence of such a truncated version of her creator was acutely painful in the emotional sense. It certainly kept her own computer busy balancing her brain chemistry. Perhaps too busy. We were concerned, Locke said. You're not supposed to be alone out here. If anything happened to you... She laughed at him. If anything happens to me, it will be my own fault. And there would be nothing you could do about it. Well, I don't want to be the one to tell Tricker that you were left alone out here like this. His voice was sullen. Then don't tell him. Clea shrugged one shoulder. What he doesn't know won't bother him. Do you think I'm going to complain to him about it when we get back? She leaned towards him. Look, I have my work and you have yours. And guess what? My work is more important to me than yours is. I don't want to help you or hang out with you when I could be accomplishing things on my own. They'd already discussed all of this ad nauseum before they all set out to work this morning. Possibly the human was nervous and wanted to cover his butt in case Tricker somehow found out about her working independently. By the way, if we're not supposed to be alone out here, then where the hell is Kushner? Locke shuffled his heavily booted feet. He'll be all right. Well, so will I. Clea snapped in frustration. The scientist drew himself up. But you're a woman. Does he honestly think I'm unaware of my gender? She wondered, momentarily confused. Her computer gave her a prompt. Human females have historically been considered the weaker sex. She almost laughed aloud. Yes, she agreed quietly. I'm a woman. Sort of. But I'm also a lot younger than both of you and in much better shape. I suggest that you two watch out for each other and leave me to my no doubt deserved fate. There's no need for you to get snippy, Locke said huffily. I'm only trying to help. There's no need for you to get patronizing. Go away, I'm busy. They stared at each other. It's a good thing he can't really see my face, the I-950 thought. He'd probably have a heart attack. Of course, then at least half of her problem would be solved. Killing them both was so tempting. She could toss the bodies down a crevasse today, and by the time searchers found them, the two would be so frozen no one would be able to tell exactly when they'd died. And even if she beat them to a pulp, they'd most likely attribute the wounds to the fall. Then she'd be free to work in peace. A perfect solution. Except it would also redouble Tricker's surveillance. She sighed, looking around at the white landscape with its drifting wisps of ice crystal under the deep purple-blue sky. In the long run, she supposed the best thing to do was simply to put up with them. But it is so tempting. Without them, I could imagine there were no humans in the world at all. This place is clean. Look, the I-950 said, trying to sound conciliatory. I'll call in every half hour. If anything at all seems to be going wrong, I'll call you and immediately head back to camp. Clea shrugged. What more can I do? If I don't do this now, it will be time to go back, and I will have accomplished nothing. Locke folded his arms across his chest and seemed about to speak. Unless you'd both like to give up some of your time out here to stay with me while I work, she suggested. He barked a laugh. The thing is, Tricker... Here we go again, she thought. Who's going to tell him? Clea demanded. I'm not, she shrugged. Look, it's cold out here and we're losing working time. Why don't we discuss this later back at camp? Just like they had every day so far. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. All right, he said. Then almost reluctantly, he turned and tottered off. Clea watched him go. Suddenly, an image of him squirming on the ice with blood pouring from his mouth came to her. If only, she thought, and regretted the virtue of necessity. She looked down at the seal. Its heartbeat was normal, and it seemed to be sleeping naturally. The circuit that activated the machines she'd implanted was controlled by another one in her complex and somewhat bulky wristwatch. Clea activated them, testing each one in turn and getting a positive signal. Now, all that remained was to give them an actual field test. Something to look forward to, she thought. She looked behind her and saw Locke disappearing around a wind-sculpted ridge of snow, touched with exquisite shades of pale blue. Clea watched for a full minute and saw no sign of him, not even in the ultraviolet stage. Her ears hadn't picked anything up that sounded human either. Picking up her backpack and sliding it on, she jogged off, looking for another leopard seal. Time wasted delayed Skynet's advent. Kurt was there to greet her in the chamber that resembled an airlock when they came in off the ice. Clea grinned and ran into his arms, wrapping her legs around his waist and kissing him passionately. "We have permission to work together," Kurt murmured in her ear when they came up for air. Then he licked her neck. The I-950 giggled and snuggled her head into his shoulder. "Good," she whispered. "I hate to break this up, kids," Tricker said, "but we have some things to discuss." Clea continued to cling to Weimeister like a monkey as she glanced over her shoulder at Tricker. She offered him a lazy smile. "Oh? Then let's make an appointment," she suggested. "Hey, I'm free now," he said, appearing totally unimpressed by their display of heated sensuality. The I-950 looked adoringly at Kurt. "But I'm busy," she said. Then she looked over her shoulder again at Tricker. "Perhaps in a couple of hours." "Perhaps now." Tricker didn't try to hide his dislike for either of them most times. Now he seemed to be doing his best to project it. He had an extremely effective way of suggesting what he was seeing when he looked at a person. Something reminiscent of a small, yapping, incontinent dog that might be too valuable to be put down. Weimeister moved his hands from Clea's waist to cup her buttocks. He hoisted her up, and she laughed. 2 hours, he said, and started to walk off. "Kurt," Tricker said, pointedly not looking at the muscular scientist and his comely burden. "You make me wait, I make you wait." Kurt and Clea looked at each other and sighed as one, then smiled wickedly. He let her down slowly, and she came over to the security chief. "What exactly is there to discuss? You've received permission for me to work with my friend." "So?" She shrugged, her eyes wide. "I need to know what you're going to do about your work," he said through clenched teeth. "I think this is more important," Clea told him. "If you only knew how much more important, human." "Once my attention is engaged like this, it's very difficult for me to concentrate on anything else." "So you're just going to abandon the work you were brought here to do?" "Well, actually." She produced a disc and handed it to him with a sweet smile. "It's largely finished. I think you'll find several people here," she named them, "can handle the remaining details. That's okay with you, isn't it?" Tricker bit the inside of his cheek. "Sure," he said after a moment. He gave her an insincere smile. "Run along, kids. Get some work done. The sarcasm was as thick as butter. All in good time. Clea blew him a kiss, then engulfed Weimeister's muscular arm in a hug and looked up at him. All in good time. She walked off with Kurt, feeling as happy as was possible for her to feel without Skynet whispering in her mind. She looked forward to the sex she would soon be having with Kurt, and it was good that she now had official permission to work with him on Skynet. No one on Earth, with the exception of Alyssa, could offer more help in developing its intelligence. And as a bonus, she'd annoyed Tricker again. Serena had regarded him as an exceptional human being, but Clea wasn't finding him to be that formidable. He hadn't even pursued her resemblance to her parent, which, frankly, was a relief. It was also a relief to know that she'd finally convinced her computer to allow her natural reactions to sex to prevail. She'd successfully argued that as she was less experienced than her predecessor, she was less able to fake her reactions. Therefore, it was reasonable to assume that someone as intelligent as Weimeister would almost certainly detect her lack of enthusiasm. Her stomach fluttered pleasantly in anticipation. Life was good. Route 9, Paraguay. Wendy had, somehow, thought of Paraguay as a small country. She supposed that was because it looked like a peanut nestled between Brazil and Argentina. But the place was as big as most American states, and its character had changed completely since she'd passed the Brazilian border. Lush, semi-tropical forest full of smoking clearings had given way to flat, dry grasslands, where scattered cattle grazed between occasional clumps of palms. It smelled strange too, hot in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Dusty, like spices and acrid musk. Even the smells of cattle were alien. She'd been a city girl all her life. According to what John had told her, he was living on a farm or something just outside Villa Hayes. Sometimes it sounded like he was talking about Dogpatch, and sometimes like the Ponderosa. She was tired, and she was hungry, and she was fighting the feeling that she was hopelessly lost. It was hot, and everything she'd brought with her was made of black velvet, at Snog's insistence. She'd kill for a t-shirt and shorts right now. Money was rapidly running out, making her want to continue to drive, not stopping for bed or food. But she could barely keep her eyes open. Besides fighting sleep, she was fighting the sneaking suspicion that John wouldn't be too happy to see her. Should she call him, warn him that she was coming? What if he said no, he wouldn't help her? Wendy's heart beat faster at the thought, exhaustion allowing panic a foothold. Her ordinary, sunny self-confidence was gradually eroding in the face of the sheer foreignness of her surroundings, not to mention her circumstances. She was homesick and scared and very lonely. Wendy found it disconcerting to realize just how protected she had always been until now. She'd always considered herself an independent, self-sufficient type of woman. But I'm really just a clueless college girl on the lam. Wendy licked dry lips and decided to press on, deciding she wouldn't give John a chance to say no. After everything else she'd been through over the last few days, she was learning to take things as they came. Von Rossbach Estancia, Paraguay. Epifanio Ayala, von Rossbach's overseer, watched the plume of dust approach the main house of the estancia and assumed it was yet another delivery. They had received many such in the last few days. Although little remained, for Don von Rossbach and young John had taken the accumulation away to Asuncion in the estancia's truck yesterday. Epifanio's wife, Marietta, from whom almost no secret could be kept for long, had informed him that these things were mostly very warm winter clothing and expensive camping gear. "Maybe they are going mountain climbing," he'd suggested. Marietta had only shrugged and rolled her eyes expressively. But he'd known what she meant. Ever since he'd met Senora Krieger, Signor von Rossbach had been going away without warning to do who knew what. Epifanio shook his head as he watched the dust plume grow closer. The Senor was a nice man, and Senora Krieger and her son, they were nice too. But since they'd come home, Epifanio himself was the only one involved in running the estancia. True, he was the overseer, it was his job. But not so very long ago, Senor von Rossbach had taken an interest in every aspect of the ranch, riding out to check the cattle, making plans to improve the stock and the land. It was worrying to see such a change in him. Marietta thought it was for the best. "He is much more alive," she'd insisted. And she favoured the Senora's presence. But that was a woman for you, always hoping for romance. To him, it seemed there was never a woman more cold and businesslike than Sarah Krieger. Although she, too, was neglecting her business, staying mostly at the estancia fiddling with the computer. And that bandage on her hip. He was a peaceful man, but he knew a gunshot wound when he saw it. The dust wasn't coming from a delivery truck, it seemed, but from a small sedan, so covered with dirt that its original color was completely hidden. His brows rose. Those were Brazilian plates, common enough in Asuncion, but not in the country. Epifanio rose from his seat on the portal and went down the steps to stand before the great house, patiently waiting for the car to arrive. No doubt it was some lost traveler, for the vehicle certainly didn't belong to anyone Ayala knew, and the Senor and his guests never received visitors. He could dimly see the figure of a woman through the dirty glass of the side window as she pulled up beside him. Epifanio waved some of the swirling dust that accompanied her aside with his hat, and took in details to relate to Marietta later on. The car was new and designed for city driving. Its low-slung chassis must have had a hard time on the rough roads surrounding the estancia. A very impractical vehicle, with no storage capacity to speak of, and much too small for a family of any size. It seemed to be a pale blue under the dust. The woman inside slumped behind the wheel, unmoving, and after a moment Epifanio tapped lightly on the window to get her attention. She lifted her head with a start, as though she'd fallen asleep. Then she rolled down the window. He saw that she hadn't been sleeping, but reading. It was a girl, perhaps 19 years old and very tired-looking, dressed in black velvet and sweating because of it. She glanced from him to her book and brushed a hank of sweat-soaked dark hair back from her face with one hand. Then she told him, in terrible Spanish, that she was looking for John Krieger. Really, it was the only name that gave him a clue as to what she wanted. What a terrible accent, he thought. She probably didn't speak Spanish at all, but was parroting phrases from the book. Senor Krieger is not here right now, he said politely. He will not be back for several hours, I think. Epifanio had taken care to speak slowly so that she would understand, but the girl looked back at him with big eyes that held no more understanding than a cow's. See, no Spanish at all. And not likely to speak Guarani, which was his only other language beyond a few words of German. She looked so tired and so lost that he couldn't help but take pity on her. Senora Krieger, perhaps she could help you, he offered. Alarm flashed briefly in her eyes, then her mouth firmed, and she nodded once. Opening the door, she stood, as stiff as an old lady. Then she said, "Sí, Senora Krieger, por favor." Epifanio smiled at her, pleased at their progress, and gestured towards the portal with his hat, holding out his other arm as though to herd her into the house. To his surprise, she put her hand on his arm to steady herself, and he instantly took her elbow to support and guide her. Marietta was going to love this. Sarah looked up from her work, frowning at Epifanio's knock. Beside him was a young woman in a long-sleeved, ankle-length and ill-fitting black dress. If her hair hadn't been purple, Sarah would have thought she was a very young nun. Suddenly, something about the girl clicked, and Sarah said to herself, "American." "Yes," she said aloud. "Pardon my intrusion, senora, but the young lady," he gestured at the girl with his hat, "is looking for your son, I think." Sarah's eyes flicked to the girl, and if looks were bullets, Wendy would have been dead before she hit the floor. Only part of it was due to the continuing dull pain in Sarah's hip. "Thank you, Epifanio," she said, rising from the desk. "I'll take care of it." Switching to English, she said to the girl, "Won't you come in?" The girl swallowed visibly and, with a nervous glance at the overseer, tottered stiffly into the room. Sarah frowned. "Are you ill?" she asked. "No, ma'am. I've just been driving for a very long time." The girl gave her a nervous smile. She dropped into the chair that Sarah had indicated, like a sack of potatoes. What a wuss. Hungry? Sarah asked crisply. Yes, ma'am. She asked Epifanio to tell his wife to bring sandwiches and fruit juice, and watched him go before she sat down again. Then she looked across the desk at her. No, at John's visitor. You're from MIT, she stated. John's recruits had been sending reports every other day, but there had been no word in over a week. Obviously, something had gone seriously wrong. Perhaps wrong enough to send a messenger. What happened? It was hard, but she kept the anger out of her voice as much as she could. This child was so spooked that she'd probably faint if she had any idea how close to killing Mad Sarah was. She should reserve her anger for John, who had obviously given out just a little more information than he should have. Forcing herself to seem calm, Sarah leaned back and waited for the girl's explanation. God, what a bitch, Wendy thought. It had never occurred to her that John wouldn't be home when she arrived, and she longed for him now more than she longed for sleep. If she'd thought about his mother at all, it was as a distant presence to whom she would be brought after she'd explained everything to him, and at least had had a shower. She hadn't felt this much like an importunate intruder since her first interview at MIT. Well, that was nothing, Wendy told herself, squaring her shoulders. And I'll get through this. After waking up to find one of her heroes blown to pieces in front of her, and the police after her for murder, one overbearing woman shouldn't be too hard to take. But oh, how she longed for John. She took a deep breath and rapidly gave John's mother a succinct report. By the time she finished, she was slurring her words in exhaustion. Just then, a motherly-looking woman came in with a tray of food. John's mother cleared a section of the desk and said something in Spanish. The woman gave Wendy a thorough looking over and a slight smile. Wendy could feel her color rise. She'd never been so grubby in her life. She actually smelled. Tired as she was, the embarrassment she felt was almost too much. Tears welled up in her eyes and she looked down, hoping to hide this final humiliation from John's hard-assed mother. I will not cry, she thought fiercely. I will not. Sarah poured juice into the glasses, glancing at Wendy from under her lashes. The kid looked like she was going to break down and bawl at any moment. My God, what a wuss! What did John see in her? She handed Wendy a glass of juice, and the girl took it with an almost inaudible, "Thank you." Sarah sat down and took a sip from her own glass, watching Wendy take careful sips of the juice. Not thirsty? She asked. You don't have to drink it. The girl glanced up, then looked down again. Yes, her eyes were red and her eyelashes moist. A real crybaby. I haven't eaten or drunk anything for a while, Wendy said at last, her voice sounding surprisingly strong. And I'm nervous, so I'm just being careful. One corner of her mouth lifted, and she raised her eyes to meet Sarah's. I wouldn't want to be sick all over your parquet floor. Thank you, Sarah said, her chin resting on her fist. It's not my floor, but I appreciate the thought. She straightened up and crossed her legs, taking a sip of her juice. What I don't appreciate is that you're here. And why? Wendy dropped her gaze to her drink and went absolutely still as, once again, colour flooded her cheeks. She tipped her head to one side. I guess, her eyes met Sarah's, that we thought you might be able to tell me what to do. Because of being unjustly accused and all, Sarah asked with a wave of her hand. Wendy nodded, her gaze unwavering. Something in her eyes told Sarah that she had caught the sarcasm and didn't like it. To be honest, Sarah said, picking a speck of lint from her skirt and smoothing down the fabric. I don't think I've ever been unjustly accused. She grinned at Wendy's undisguised astonishment. I've done it all, she said breezily. I've bombed, I've run guns, I've smuggled drugs. Extortion, bribery, destruction of property, assault and battery. She ticked her crimes off on her fingers. I'm guilty, guilty, guilty. I've never killed anybody. Anybody human. And I've never been involved in a kidnapping. Not that I didn't have the opportunities. And I've never sold myself. But other than that, she shrugged, watching for the girl's reaction. Even better, Wendy said after a moment's pause. If you're guilty of all of that and you're still not in jail, you could probably write a book on the subject. Sarah was taken by surprise. So maybe the kid does have a spine, she thought. She hoped so if John was in any way involved with her. Still, she'd come here in trouble, and possibly dragging trouble behind her. One of the ways we've stayed out of jail is by not allowing people being chased by the police to come directly to our door, she said pointedly. Nobody knows where I am, Wendy said. The closest anyone can trace me is Sao Paulo. That's closer than I like, Sarah snapped. Look, Wendy said carefully. I didn't stop driving once I left Sao Paulo. I bought a bunch of food which ran out the day before yesterday and juice which ran out last night. I haven't stopped or spoken to anybody since I left the border, except 3 times to buy gas. And since I got lost twice on lonely roads with no human beings around for as far as the eye could see, and since from here that's pretty far, I seriously doubt I was followed. Okay? Sarah felt herself relax, marginally. She chose a sandwich and started to nibble. To her amusement, the girl seemed to take it as a signal that she, too, could begin eating, and chose one for herself. Well, I suppose she is right. I don't approve of her being here after all. Non-stop, Sarah said, raising her brows. All the way from Brazil. Yes. Quite a drive, Sarah commented. Especially if you get lost, Wendy agreed, nibbling delicately at the home-baked bread. Did you have to ask for directions? Sarah asked casually. Wendy looked up at her, impatience briefly plain on her face. No, she said carefully. I worked it out by myself. She put the sandwich down and then looked Sarah full in the face. I would never do anything that might cause John the slightest risk. The two women locked gazes, and Sarah felt a sinking feeling in her middle. No doubt this is how every mother feels when her son gets his first serious girlfriend. And if anything, Wendy here appeared deadly serious. I wonder how John feels about her. Was he going to be thrilled to see her? Or was he going to react as though she was a stalker? That thought sent another spasm of uncertainty through her gut. After all, she had only Wendy's word that she'd been framed. And do I know anything about her? No. John had barely mentioned her name. She waggled her foot thoughtfully. He could be shy about confiding in his mother about it, or he might be as surprised and dismayed as she was to find out that he had a girlfriend. And there was a time when I was a student with a part-time job too. And then my world fell apart. Well, she'd find out when he got home. In the meantime... You look exhausted, she said. Wendy looked up at her. Why don't we take this? She stood, wincing slightly at the pull of the healing wound, and picked up the tray. Upstairs. I'll show you your room for tonight. There's a bathroom en suite, so you can have some privacy. Just leave the tray outside the door when you're finished. Wendy stood, still a little wobbly. Thank you. Sarah glanced at her. The kid was dead on her feet. I know what that feels like. She'd felt that way too often at the end of a hard trip. We'll see, she thought, and turned to lead the way upstairs.